Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
So I'll be presenting on India and its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as of now, India's total confirmed cases are around 4 million, and total confirmed deaths are around 68,000. Active cases today are 800,000, and confirmed recoveries are 3 million. So one thing that's very important to keep in mind while thinking about India and COVID-19 is this word confirmed. Because India has been lagging behind in testing a lot, this is not really a good the actual numbers. So one study that was conducted very recently, an antibody study, showed that 1 in 4 people in Delhi had antibodies for COVID-19, which means that they had COVID-19 at some point. And this is only for 30 million people. So if you even extrapolate that for a 1.38 billion people population, even if at a smaller percentage of what the antibody study showed, the situation is quite dire. And experts did warn this when the virus was starting to take a hold in India. So how did we get here? So from December 31st, when the WHO first announced coronavirus, to March 3rd, like when Prime Minister Modi made his first statement on coronavirus, there was basically a 2-month period in which nothing happened, and cases started to show up, but they were mostly imported cases. As you can see, on January 30th, the first case was reported of an Indian student from Wuhan University who had come home for vacations, and he was the first reported case. And following that, India started canceling visas and for all Chinese citizens and people with travel history to China. They also started repatriation flights for Indian citizens stuck in COVID hotspots. However, this further exacerbated the spread of the disease in India by importing potentially infected people and putting them in quarantine places which themselves became COVID hotspots because of improper facilities. On March 3rd, when Modi tweeted that there's no need to panic, that was when the government first started looking at this. And on March 6th, India started screening all international arrivals. On March 11th, when WHO declared the pandemic, there was already substantial evidence of community transmission in India, even though the Ministry of Health continued to say it was not a health emergency and continued to deny that there was any evidence of community transmission. Although some local states started taking unilateral actions and declaring public health emergencies, this was only 4 out of the 24 states did anything of the sort. On March 17th, the Indian Council for Medical Research, which is the Indian equivalent of CDC, the US CDC, extended its testing guidelines to include everybody who was symptomatic rather than just people who had history of travel. And on March 22nd, the Prime Minister enforced a voluntary lockdown for 14 hours and asked people to light candles to give hope to the poor. And he then went on to hold virtual meetings with the governors of the different states. So this was a very interesting action because a voluntary lockdown for 14 hours, nobody could understand what the point was, but a lot of people did comply with it. And the lighting of the candles was, it was joked that India's being so technologically advanced with its countering of the pandemic. But many experts believe by the time on March 25th, a national lockdown which was imposed, community transmission had already began, because India is a very popular tourist destination, and there was a lot of tourism coming from places like China and Italy and a bunch of other COVID hotspots, which basically came in till March 25th. On the date when international flights were suspended and a national lockdown was imposed. The problem with the national lockdown, which was initially imposed for 2 weeks, was that it was done without planning for issues like where are people going to get their essential supplies? What about people who are daily wage workers? How are they going to pay for their meals and their rent? So this led to, and the government somehow recognized that and tried to announce a economic stimulus to help this, but it didn't really help because the government failed to place a moratorium on rent for migrant workers, which caused a migrant crisis in which a lot of daily wage workers who were in these metropolitan areas, which were initially the hotspots because of international airports being there, they started literally walking back to their smaller towns and villages, essentially taking the disease with them and spreading it across the country. And so in late March, the first local cluster of coronavirus was found in Tablighi Jamaat, which is a Muslim conference in Delhi. And essentially, instead of accepting that there was community transmission happening, what the government did was they started demonizing this already suppressed minority, which is a tactic which normally works for the Indian government whenever they bump into a problem. But instead of helping them, what happened was it had two major impacts. First was it stigmatized the concept of the coronavirus, in which in turn led to people, first of all, not wanting to get tested for it. Second of all, if their relatives died because of COVID-related symptoms, they were just not reported to the authorities and finished the the funeral rituals really fast. And that's why the death toll, which has been surprisingly low in India, given the healthcare system, it has been questioned. On April 2nd, India did set up a contract tracing app called the Arogya Setu app. However, there were a lot more privacy concerns than the apps that other people showed for different countries. First of all, one of the stark issues was the app using both GPS and Bluetooth. So it would essentially just track you all the time. Also, it was mandatory, and there were legal challenges to this, similar, just like in Israel. And it was not open source, so no one can tell what the app was actually doing. And there were no clear guidelines on when your data would be deleted after you were using the app.
You're running out of time, so let's wrap up soon.
I will. So on April 22nd, the cases continue to double, and the government projected that there would be 0 cases by May 16th, which was obviously not true. In May, there were more economic packages. However, they lacked support for healthcare services and were mainly aimed at providing support for large businesses. They did set up trains for migrant workers to go home, so that was a good thing. India started a phased reopening with record-breaking daily new cases of 10,000, and only have had performed 400,000 cases overall till this point. Today, after almost 2 months of reopening, India reported 84,000 new cases today, and has had some very stark arbitrary reopening policies, such as online schooling, which seems like a good use of technology. However, in a country like India, it's totally infeasible to implement. They also are forcing in-person exams for college entrance exams, which basically pack 30,000 kids in the same hall. There are also very inconsistencies in which festivals are allowed and which are not. And there are weird things like weekend lockdowns, as if COVID only spreads on the weekend. The GDP also shrank 28% last quarter, which is quite stark. So essentially what went wrong? In the beginning, like they underplayed the virus. The policies were more superficial and rather than well thought out. There was definite lack of planning before imposing the lockdown. And even after the lockdown was imposed, there was no planning on what to do next. And there was a stark lack of understanding of what the country's ground reality was. So one last thing I want to show is that this is the point at which the lockdown started, and this is the point at which the lockdown was lifted, and this is what happened afterwards. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Victor. Nicely done. Looks like we need a lot of time to digest all that great information.
Yeah, there was quite a bit.
Any question?
I'm not surprised that Victor's presentation was that awesome. Good job there.
Thank you.
Any question from Ryan? You've been quiet.
Oh no, I'm listening and taking notes. No questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Victor pointed out many interesting facts, and it would be nice to be able to contrast them with other countries and how what's working, what's not working in the following lectures. But I think right now we have a good understanding of what just happened in India.
I think that's actually a pretty good presentation by Victor. One of the points, I guess, that I may not have done extensive research on this, but is just that I think, again, during the time that the lockdown was imposed or just before the lockdown was imposed, I think they had pretty stringent contact tracing policies, at least in the metropolitan cities. And I think because of different internal non-compliance by citizens, there were, sort of things started to spread out. And then the government sort of reduced its contact tracing, strategies. Because earlier, just before the lockdown, from what I can remember, people actually used to go physically to different places to tell them that, they had different COVID symptoms, or that they had different tested, or that they had tested positive. And, they had a couple of rules surrounding it. But I think after a certain point in time, they just dissolved that and had a completely online structure.
And also the question of national reserve, like in the case of Singapore, we could stay in a 5-star hotel for a quarantine. I think India simply doesn't have the resources to do any of that.
True, definitely.
There is that practical limitation as well. All right, let's move on to UK.
Okay, I'll share my screen.